Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amani Jamal. I'm the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs. So happy to see all of you here for our Dean's Leadership Speaker Series event. At Princeton SPIA, we meet the moment. We are out in the world engaging directly with the most pressing issues of the day. And what better illustration of this than our numerous initiatives around artificial intelligence? From the Princeton AI dialogues at the SPIA DC Center, to the Undergraduate Task Force on AI and National Security, to AI-related research by our Center for Information Technology Policy, we are working hard to inform lawmakers and educate current and future public servants about policy challenges and innovation opportunities. Today's discussion will explore how states, technology firms, civil society, and international organizations can coordinate on AI tasks despite competing interests and diverging approaches. Topics include bridging the global AI divide, building toward durable international cooperation, and what meaningful digital inclusion looks like for countries and communities being left behind. We are privileged to have such a distinguished expert to walk us through these complex concepts. Amandeep Singh Gill is the United Nations Under-Secretary General and Special Envoy for Digital and Emerging Technologies. In that capacity, he leads strategic technology initiatives, facilitates coordination across UN, and engages global stakeholders. Undersecretary General Gill is also a member of the Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on AI and Scientific Advisory Board. Previously, he was Executive Director of the UN's High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation and India's Ambassador to the Conference of Disarmament. And in 2024, Time Magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in AI. A few brief reminders before we begin. Please listen respectfully and with an open mind. Remain calm and curious. And if you're inclined to engage with our speakers, please ask questions and don't give speeches. Challenge ideas, not people. Allow space for other voices, and please give our speakers the courtesy of your undivided attention. Thank you to Amandeep Gill for joining us, and to everyone in attendance for today's event, which is made possible by the Morfit 1997 Distinguished Visitor Fund. Thanks as well to the Center for Information Technology Policies, Arvind Narayanan, who will moderate this afternoon. And as it so happens, Arvind was named to Time's 2023 list of the 100 most influential people in AI policy in AI as well. So now we have two of Time's 100 most influential AI people right here sitting with us today. Great honor. And Arvind, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean Jamal. Really appreciate the introduction. Great to see so many of you here. I think all talks should come with the brief remarks that you made on how to keep it curious and respectful and so on. Really appreciated that. So definitely look forward to the conversation. So I want to talk about the specific work you've been doing, but before we even get there, I think your career is an inspiration to so many of us. You've done so many things. You were in the Indian Foreign Service, and then you worked in peace and disarmament for many years, and then you gradually pivoted to AI. So I'd like to help folks understand that career path a little bit. Did one thing lead to another? Did you make a clean break at some point? And then I have some follow-up questions, but I'm curious to start with that aspect.
Thank you for having me, Arvind, and thank you to the Dean for that kind introduction. I think I kind of followed her advice, just being curious about things in my career. I trained as an engineer, so electronics and communication. George Shannon was a guru for a while. I worked in the industry and then joined the Foreign Service because I was curious about the world and happened to work a lot on strategic technologies. So the technology, international relations, national, international security triangle. So that's where I worked for a while. And coming to the UN was kind of like coming home to my roots as an engineer with an additional perspective of a social scientist. So in between, I took a break. I went to Stanford. So it's my first time at Princeton, and it's a beautiful campus. So There are some comparisons going on in my mind, but it's a lovely campus that you have the privilege to be in. So social sciences, policy learning, uh, so that allowed me kind of like, how do you bridge this? Because we technologists, you are a computer scientist, have a kind of hubris. We can reduce the world's complexity to zeros and ones and, fix it somehow, solve big problems by waving the tech magic wand. But then when you do social science, you realize, the world is very complex and messy. And so I think this is what is beautiful about this job, that you try and bring these different realities to them.
That's great. So you draw upon your skills as an engineer, you draw upon social science skills, and the day-to-day work that you do at the UN, what are some of the core skills that are involved? Because it's not a regulatory function. It's so it's not, I'm guessing, primarily legal skills. So I'm curious to understand the way in which you drive change, the way in which the UN accomplishes change in the world.
I think the most important skill on a daily basis that you need is understanding different perspectives. The ability to see any issue from, let's say we have 193 member states, at least from, as many perspectives as possible. Because, and then as many sectors as possible. Because, the governments tend to look at tech from a certain way. Huge opportunity in terms of wealth creation, huge opportunity to accumulate power and get along to a better place in the geopolitical competition. But civil society and the private sector, they have their own. So ability to kind of understand these different perspectives and then somehow navigate the policy space. So with those different perspectives to still get some outcomes. Because you can just be bamboozled by these different perspectives and kind of frozen into inaction. But you have to, like in the language of international learning, policy learning, so how do you advance knowledge construction? So I think that's the kind of most important skill you need. Part of that is the design of forums. Part of that is how those forums work. What are the incentives around engagement in those forums? I'm very pleased to have Arji here, who's a member of the new Independent International Science Panel at the UN. Like this forum, how does that advance shared scientific understanding around the world on AI's impacts, opportunities, and risks? So I think this, how to keep moving despite those different things.
That's great. You talked about international policy learning. It would be great to go into detail on that. How does that happen? What are the barriers? Perhaps you could give an example of policy learning in action.
Let me just address the barriers a little bit. I mean, one good way, Hugh Heckler, who's a big influence in my PhD, so he compared policy learning to a maze, where some people are trying to get out, but others don't even agree that getting out is a good outcome for policy. And he talked about the dialectic of power and puzzling. So you power and puzzle through complex policy issues. And I think power is important, but it's not only power that's concentrated in a few places, but short-term differentials in power. That's why coalitions are so interesting in the UN. They create these short-term spikes in the power distribution, and that allows you to push an issue along. And the importance of puzzling, especially because we are in a university campus. So ideas matter. I mean, going back to some of the sociologists, so ideas in knowledge construction. So if you have good ideas, you can find a path for those ideas to come move together. Where also the role of epistemic communities, knowledge communities in academia and civil society, scientists. So then, you can kind of speak truth to power and, work with, because power is a reality. As a diplomat, you cannot ignore that reality. But, if you bring powering and puzzling together, then international learning can advance. And you asked for an example. So in my own career, I've seen this twice. Once when I was chairing the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, we had a failure, where, the conference of state parties could not agree on an outcome. But the challenge, this was pre-pandemic. So pandemic was a natural disease outbreak, but deliberate disease outbreak can really bring the world economy down. The stakes were high, but they were able to curate the kind of discussions that were needed, build the incentives so that everyone agreed on a kind of a forward-leaning program for that convention. It's not always easy. Sometimes you have to trim your sails. You don't get binding agreement each time. But I think if you keep following the idea rather than the process, you remain more hopeful and you are perhaps guaranteed of success more than.
That makes sense. So one way in which power connects to the tech and AI topic is the AI divide, which I know you've drawn a lot of attention to. So would love to talk about that a bit. Help us understand why the AI divide exists, how bad it is now, and how that sets the background conditions for a lot of what is happening when it comes to the UN.
Right. This is one thing that I care about a lot. The Secretary General cares about a lot. He says AI shouldn't stand for advancing inequality. And I think let's understand the divide. There are several divides: the energy divide, the development divide. You have the digital divide, 2.6 billion people still not connected to the internet. And even when they're connected, data costs, what kind of device. We saw that with the pandemic. People who had nice laptops could really benefit from education. Others, were left behind. So there's that. And on top of that, you have the data and AI data. So to give you an example, all of Africa, there's a Kenyan friend of mine who says, we've been made the 1% continent, 1% of data center capacity, 1% of GPUs. All of Africa had last year less GPUs than, a decent university like, say, Fudan University in China. And so that's the kind of at the compute level. There's also talent gap. Large number of countries do not have even 5 experts that their leadership can call on to advise me. I have a summit with the European Union. AI is on the agenda. What are our interests? What should we be saying or doing? So it's such a gap. Then data sets. So you've not curated your own data sets. Languages, low resource languages, data sets are not there. So there's this many dimensions of this AI divide, which we have looked at very carefully. But I think the important issue is how do we address the AI divide? So some ideas that we presented, including the idea of a global fund on AI for urgent investments in the 80, 90 countries most at risk of getting left behind. They don't have the minimum national capacity to govern AI, to even absorb AI that's developed elsewhere. And then you need to kind of do development cooperation differently, because funds are kind of like 20th century instrument. We need them, but you need more like agile instruments for building capacity. So the idea of a network of centers for AI capacity building. As peer-to-peer learning, sometimes if you are with a high achiever, let's say we put you next to US or China, say you get discouraged, I will never be able to set up a frontier lab. So, but if you have near peers, then you get some confidence and you can, someone is better at data sets, someone is better at scholarships and training programs. So you exchange, in-kind exchange, that helps you build up capacity better.
You dropped some wisdom kind of in parentheses. You said funds are a 20th century instrument. That's near me. I'd love to hear more about why that is.
Right. I mean, today there's allergy to funding through multilateral institutions. Partly because of this sentiment, I would say, misplaced sentiment that multilateral institutions are not effective or they waste money, etc. But also because that development cooperation funding is going into other areas like defense spending or some other aspects. So the pie is shrinking, and so chasing a fund at this
time with governments is a difficult task. The private sector, it's a rounding error. Like, you know, I mean, look at how much money US big tech's going to spend on AI infrastructure alone. So it's less than 0.5% of that this year. But, you know, what are the incentives for the private sector to come into this? You know, we have to work that out so that it's not a 20th century, it's a 21st century instrument. Philanthropies are interested. So at the French AI Summit last year, a philanthropic effort was launched. You know, we also have some philanthropies supporting these ideas, working with the UN, but it's still, you know, the critical mass has not been built up. I see a lot of potential in mutual help. You know, you don't need to wait for help. You start to collaborate, and that's where the importance of trusted networks, network multilateralism.
Thank you. One more question before we get to the Global Digital Compact. So you talked about readiness and capacity building and the need for that, primarily, I think, through the lens of AI adoption and state capacity and so forth. Is there also a similar gap on the regulatory side?
Absolutely, 100%. So parliamentarians, their understanding of what this technology actually is, and as your book says, you know, what it can and important, what it cannot do. I think that's very important. Civil servants, senior civil servants, ministers, leaders. And leaders have today kind of, you know, like they're starry-eyed about this. They want to be standing next to CEOs. What can my country do to attract more investment, etc., without fully realizing at times, you know, what's needed in terms of the broader enabling and the governance, the management of some of the risks and so on. So we need that rapid buildup of capacity in the public sector, but society at large, AI literacy. So as students, you know, I'm sure, you know, you're using these tools, whether it's Notebook LM or some of these leading models, but how to use them wisely so that, you know, you still keep up with your cognitive skills, with some of the higher order thinking, the abstract thinking that's needed. And also, you know, society at large, industry absorption. You know, as we're talking about absorption, we have a skill gap in MSMEs, medium and small scale, small and medium enterprises, even in countries like China, which are quite advanced economy. So how do workers or middle management land these issues? So massive training, reskilling, and then there's the impact on what kind of jobs would still be relevant 3 to 5 years from now. So the entire kind of training education pipeline has to adjust. I was at a university in China, and the dean was telling me that he's put 3 departments on notice. You know, would you still need undergrad programs 5 years from now? So, you know, that kind of adjustment readiness, the education institution, society at large, industry, workers, etc. You know, huge resources are needed there, national, but also some facilitation in terms of, you know, studies and evidence on what's happening around the corner. So there's a thin sliver of global effort needed. That's essential, without which the national effort would be, you know, too siloed.
Got it. So let's turn to the Global Digital Compact. So it was published in 2024, is that right? Would love to hear about what it is, what was the process leading up to it, and then we'll come back and talk about maybe looking back what impacts it's had.
Right. So, I mean, you have the 3 pillars of the United Nations: peace and security, human rights, sustainable development, and many areas where the UN's action is kind of, you know, like taken for granted. In the technology space, we didn't have that comprehensive framework. We do have something that goes back to 2003, 2005, very important, the World Summit on Information Society. South comes the Internet Governance Forum. But that whole framework needed a refresh, because at that time, you remember there were 1 billion people on the net. There was no social media, no big data, no AIs, no misinformation, disinformation. And the main concerns were around content and connectivity. So you needed to have an updated vision. And that's where the GDC came in, the Global Digital Compact. And there was a build up to it through the high-level panel on digital cooperation, the Secretary of the Roadmap on Digital Cooperation. You know, he's a former engineer, a student of physics. So he's been very interested in this area since 2017. So this was an opportunity, 75th anniversary of the UN, what the UN needs to know, how can it be fit for purpose. So this is the kind of context. So we had a 18-month-long process, consultations across stakeholders, and a negotiation led by Sweden and Zambia, which kind of, I mean, if you're a student of international learning like me, so the work of the high-level advisory body on AI, which was a multi-stakeholder group of 39 members, industry, civil society, governments. So that worked in parallel on the AI issue. And its 7 recommendations landed in the final phase of the Global Digital Compact negotiations, and so became part of the decisions taken by member states. So I mean, it's a great example of how those conversations, which may appear kind of like, oh, a nice group, nice report, but what happened the day after? So I think you found that moment. And GDC went into 5 broad areas: bridging the digital divide and accelerating development digitally. The idea of building an inclusive digital economy, because digital economy was again something that didn't exist back in 2003, 2005. E-commerce had started to come in, but now you see it's a multi-trillion-dollar thing. How to advance that, digital public infrastructure and so. And then the crucial piece, the third piece, around human rights and safety and protection, internet governance. And then 2 new areas, data and AI. And this is where, you have decisions on, let's set up a panel, a science panel. Let's set up a regular dialogue at the UN on these issues. Not just these summits, small group meetings, but a kind of a table where 193 countries have a seat and they can shape the AI future. Let's do something about AI capacity. That was a kind of a partial decision. And then let's set up an office for digital and emerging technologies to follow up on some of these issues. So these were significant steps. Some might say, the UN could have been more ambitious, but power meets puzzling. So you have to trim your sails. I think that has given us the foundation for our work today.
So we'll go for about 5 or 10 more minutes, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion. We'll have probably 25, 30 minutes for that. So what I'm hearing is part of this is about follow-on actions for the UN itself. There's part of it also for member states, especially perhaps lower capacity member states, to then take the GDC and then operationalize it. And is that work going on?
Definitely. So we've been working with our country teams, the regional coordinators, UN regional coordinators, and the regional economic commissions in Africa and Latin America, other geographies, for that alignment between this global framework and what goes on in terms of country level plans or regional economic integration or economic development plans. To give you, 2 concrete examples. Earlier this year, I was at the ASEAN Digital Ministers meeting. They adopted a master plan for 2026-2030. And many of the Global Digital Compact themes are part of that master plan, including interoperability of digital public infrastructure as ASEAN goes about strengthening regional economic integration to be more resilient. And you see the challenges around tariffs and supply chain shifting. So, that's one aspect. And then in the Arab region, the Regional Economic Commission, even though that region has sometimes a different conception of human rights, issues around gender, for example. So, but there was an attempt by the Arab digital ministers to kind of align their regional agenda with GDC and then, take that forward. Last example I give you is, the country level landing of this, or in, some regions. We're working with some leaders in Africa to ensure that as they build out digital public infrastructure like digital ID, the payments layer, the data exchange layer, they do so with interoperability across the continent in mind. Because without that, an African entrepreneur in Ghana is not going to have the scale, continent-wide scale, for their own products and services. And so, what the European Union has taken decades to do, there's a leapfrogging opportunity for Africa using these digital, let's say, plumbings to kind of, create a kind of environment, digital economy.
There are two things there I want to go deeper into. One, you mentioned how in the Arab region, there's work to be done in taking the human rights component, and they have a different conception of human rights. So what happens there? That seems like an important tension. How do they then make progress?
I think you have to find the right angle, the respectful way to. The framing is important because if you only focus on civil and political rights, maybe there's resistance. If you go back to the vision of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and say, look, economic, social, cultural rights are also important, civil, and there's more resonance there because there is a kind of defensiveness, feeling of being threatened by this, homogenous culture coming from AI in terms of some of the local cultural, religious perspectives being suppressed. So, I think when you frame it that way, there's less resistance. Digital public infrastructure, if we frame it in terms of safeguards and inclusion, again, so that citizens kind of, you could create beautiful digital public infrastructure, but if the citizens don't trust it, they don't use it, then it undermines the eventual objectives. So I think the framing is important to cater for the world's diversity.
And on digital public infrastructure, is there a precedent for the vision that you laid out, which is interoperability between different national systems, or is this something you would hope to accomplish perhaps for the first time?
I think the original vision of the internet is definitely an inspiration, common protocols. A defragmented internet is what really sustains the digital economy, which is the fastest growing component of the GDP growth in countries as diverse as Vietnam and Peru and India and Philippines. So that is the vision, but also I think it's also our slogan of digital cooperation. In the sense, if we have, yes, there's geopolitical competition, US, China, Europe, so that's a reality. But we need to work on the interoperability aspects, on the shared challenges, so that the world, which is already quite fragmented in so many ways, doesn't fragment further in the digital data and AI space. And obviously, the private sector has an interest in this because many of these companies have global markets. Even startups that I speak to in Silicon Savannah in Kenya or in India, they say, "Oh, it'd be nice to have cross-border training data or cross-border, validation of our models." So I think people need that access across borders. In, of course, well-governed ways. So there's data protection, there's liabilities managed nicely, but I think we need to work on interoperability issues for a variety of reasons.
Can you talk about the UN's role in data protection? We were having a chat earlier, and it came up the fact that there can be often extractive relationships between American firms and citizens in different countries, especially when it comes to AI training data. So I'm curious whether through the Global Digital Compact or other efforts, if you see a role for the UN in that particular aspect of human rights.
Right. So data is one of those 5 areas covered by the GDC, the 4th pillar. So it created for the first time in the UN a track on data governance. So there is a group, it's called the Working Group on Data Governance, which has started meeting in Geneva. The Brazilian ambassador there is a chair. It's a multi-stakeholder group. So you have representatives from Microsoft and MasterCard, for example. Inside of that, you have academics and other experts. Wendy Hall from the University of Southampton is there. So they are looking at what kind of principles for data governance, because you have different regulatory approaches. The European Union, India's DPDP Act, and Brazil's Act, and so on. How can we kind of align data protection? There is kind of already in the trade context, you have recognition of data protection. but more broadly. And then they are also going to look at notions around data for development, data commons. And we believe at the UN that in some areas we need common efforts on bringing data together. So let's say climate change resilient agriculture. If data sets on planting times, inputs, etc., from different geographies which are stressed by these shifting conditions, if those data sets can be pooled, then researchers everywhere will benefit. So you look at data at one level as a proprietary issue, as an issue around which commercial advantage and moats can be built. But at another level, there is a kind of a global dimension, planetary dimension, where, let's say airline safety data, different airlines have an incentive to pool that. What are the ways to incentivize that kind of thing? So this is the work that they are undertaking. 2027, their report is due. And I do hope that this leads to more regular kind of work. Last thing I mentioned here is in the recommendations of the high-level advisory body on AI, there is a very important recommendation on having a framework where data can be used, let's say, more broadly. So where value can be created by more people, and some of these risks that are getting loaded on to some communities, they work with very difficult kind of data around abuse and so on. So when they are, annotating those kind of, so we can have kind of like facilitation of access to the right data sets while managing some of those kind of issues. It's about shaping the future data economy. You have now laws and regulations around content, like, how do we balance protection of like the creators and their rights over their creative content with the requirements of AI companies to access data. So I think this is an important discussion to be had. We are only at the beginning stages, and we need more resources and need more support from academia and research, the research community to take that forward.
That's great to hear. One last thing for me, and then look forward to hearing your questions. So we'd love to give you a chance to say a few things about the more nascent efforts, the global dialogues, the international scientific panel, just so folks have an idea of, where things are right now and what you hope for, since those are very newly started efforts.
So this is the kind of trio of science, policy, and capacity on AI. On science, the Independent International Scientific Panel, 40 experts, a very competitive process, 2,700 candidates, they were, and then they have now got together. Yoshua Benju and Maria Ressa have been elected as chairs. They're currently working through their internal organization in terms of working groups, but they have a deadline. July, the first reporting is due. They can do an annual report and up to 2 thematic reports every year. And these reports are supposed to be policy relevant and not policy prescriptive. So people assess the evidence as they wish to assess it. My boss calls this the evidence engine of the world on AI, potentially. And also to help address this information asymmetry. You have a few people who know a lot, and you have a lot of people who don't know much. I mentioned that earlier. So hopefully the panel's reports will educate policymakers around the world, address that information asymmetry, help people anticipate what's coming around the corner. And the second effort is the policy dialogue, which takes place on 6th and 7th July in Geneva, back to back with the ITU's AI for Good meeting. And then the next edition would be in New York. So it'll travel back and forth between Geneva and New York, where we have two co-chairs, Estonia and El Salvador. They are now consulting on what should be the themes of the dialogue, how should we organize it. The panel's report is on the agenda of the dialogue, but there will be opportunities for others to kind of engage on governance issues. At the office, working through a lab we have in Valencia, the AI Governance for Humanity Lab, we're trying to support this discussion with two potential knowledge products. One is understanding the differentiated landscape of AI governance. What's the common vocabulary? What are the commonalities? What are the differences? And the other is, how's the private sector landing this in their practice? So the cutting edge of AI governance, because practice is shaping governance. It's like customary law that you're building up, day-to-day actions in the US, in China, other places are building up that. So we need to understand that. I think the third piece on capacity building, I mentioned the fund idea, which is under discussion by member states. And also some centers have come together to start a network of exchange and cooperation on AI capacity building. So these are the kind of current areas of focus for us.
Amazing. Great to see so much going on. Do we have someone with a mic, or how are we? Great. The hands already in the front here.
Thank you so much, and thank you, USG Gill, for joining us here today. Nadara Youssef, prior to being at Princeton, I was chair of the UN Civil Society Conference for the Summit of the Future, so launching the AI Impact Coalitions and some of the prep work leading up to the GDC. As you mentioned, there's the Global AI Dialogue in July. As I recall, one of the big issues or contentions in the negotiation of the Global Digital Compact, specifically on Objective 5 on AI, was the role of the UN in AI governance and countries disagreeing on that. So with that lens, I'm wondering what specific kind of diplomatic breakthroughs or reconciliations you're hoping for in this first global dialogue on AI that countries will agree on to kind of take the agenda forward.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I think before we adopted the Global Digital Compact, there were these differences, how intrusive the UN role could be. And I think the consensus was that UN's role is going to be providing these assessments, regular assessment, pooling the global scientific expertise. UN's role is going to be in providing a kind of horizontal platform for learning, for interoperability, so that you don't repeat costly mistakes. You learn the best lessons in terms of AI governance. It's not going to be, top-down governance. So that's already kind of, how those issues were resolved. There was also, as you recall, a strong push for addressing the AI divide. And that's where the discussion is still continuing. So we still have to reach a point of kind of decisions on that. But some efforts, like voluntary efforts, are already underway. So I think that captures what I've spoken about in terms of our current areas, obviously comes from that consensus. You can debate whether it could have been more ambitious. The high-level advisory body on AI, recommended slightly more ambitious work, but I think this is what we have for now, and let's work with it.
Thank you very much for speaking with us. We've spoken about digital governance and distribution of digital technologies. I'm wondering also if there's roles that AI and emerging digital technologies can play in addressing some international problems. And in particular, if you have thoughts, for example, regarding digital public infrastructure in rebuilding Syria or similar types of crises that new technologies can uniquely play a role in helping to solve.
This is already happening. For instance, the World Food Program, so there's hunger maps. So we bring data sets around conflicts, for example, together to predict where food insecurity is likely to break out, which allows us to pre-position the humanitarian response. And many of the humanitarian agencies, of course, there is the additional pressure from the funding cuts, but they are leveraging data and AI to conserve resources, be more effective in terms of the response. I see a lot of potential also on the peace building, peace support, peacekeeping side even. Some of it is challenges, the misinformation on peacekeeping, as in health and vaccination. But some of it is like, more positive. So how do you use equipment better? How do you, engage with communities? How do you monitor the kind of, conversations that are going on, some of which may be, radical conversation in terms of a delicate peace support, peacekeeping operation. So all those areas, my sense is that today we are more in a kind of a pilots phase with a few exceptions. There are about 700, 800 use cases around the UN system. My sense is we need to kind of, bring these together for more cross-cutting and like domain-specific capabilities. It's beginning to happen in the humanitarian space, but it should happen more in the coming 1 or 2 years. We are in a good space. The talent is, we had a problem a few years back in terms of younger talent, data science, AI. We're getting to a better place on that.
Thank you so much, Under Secretary, for this talk. I had a question about DPI. If you look at the DPI space, you have a few countries like India, Brazil, and Kenya who are leaders in the global south, and they're trying to take their products out to the rest of the world. So is there some sort of a mechanism or a common minimum understanding when it comes to a certain amount of interoperability, when it comes to data exchanges and protocols? Or do you see some sort of a competition that is going into play? You did, of course, speak about cooperation within the ASEAN region and also in the African continent. And secondly, when there's so much talk about data localization in the South, how do you get better quality training sets out into the rest of the world so that you get better AI for public good generally?
Right. I think on DPIs, I see less competition and more collaboration. So there is, of course, the India example, India Stack, is the Estonian Extro. There are other examples. I think in terms of definitional understanding, the G20 summit in India came up with a definition, but kind of, became everyone's definition. GDC, the Global Digital Compact, has a certain definition. Recently, the World Bank came up with a definition with the Gates Foundation. So we have a kind of a common understanding of what it is. And people also understand that you could take the stack approach, which is what India did, but you could also take a use cases driven approach. Not every country needs to kind of architect it the same way. So you could build DPI through different pathways. I think that's the second aspect of the common understanding. The third one on which we've also worked a bit is you need a kind of life cycle approach to DPIs to ensure inclusion and safeguards. So that, let's say, the elderly or minority communities or people who don't have literacy are not left out. So the design concept is inclusion, but you have to be careful that that design concept is being realized on a continued basis and where civil society becomes important. And we have now a large number, Toby, correct me if I'm about 65 countries, the DPI safeguards framework.
Yes, so we have about sort of 27 countries that we're supporting actively. Supporting two implement safeguard as part of that DPI implementations, and of course we have one who are looking to the framework to ensure that when they do DPI, it's inclusive by design, because as you mentioned, that's the idea, but the very nature means that if you, for example, even if you take a technology X-road or digital ID, you still, if you take that to Nigeria, just because, for example, language diversity, different, you might have inclusion risk that are different. Technology is neutral. So the idea behind it is they're actively considering how to ensure that everyone in society benefits.
Toby Kasali from the team that's doing DPIs in my office. So, and your point, the next point about, the data localization, I think there's a nice connection to DPIs. DPIs make, data available everywhere. I mean, Xroad was essentially facilitating access, and so does the India Stack. I think this is very, very important that you facilitate access to small companies, startups, and others in a kind of responsible, well-governed way. And Europe is beginning to do that. They're thinking in terms of, this 28 pillar, which kind of connects across the 27 members of the European Union. So we are focusing a lot on that interoperability, access, well-governed access aspect in our kind of, catalyzing conversations with, leaders from around the world, ASEAN, Africa, and so on. I think that leads you to, how much of this should be local effort. I think every country needs to have a kind of a local component on data in terms of language data sets, some of the sensitive data sets, health, national ID data sets, national security data sets. So those need to be, sometimes, you need to have your own sovereign data infrastructure for that. And there's also now a question around latency in terms of inference. So how much you want to have close to, so some countries can afford more data infrastructure from the latency perspective, energy supply, water, some of the design considerations in more advanced economies may be more energy intensive than. So we would like to see, more diversity and more kind of, spread of this kind of infrastructure, although some places will continue to lead, in terms of concentrated infrastructure, US, Singapore, Malaysia, for example, the Gulf and, some parts of India. That's natural, but I think we can't just dismiss data localization upfront. A balance needs to be struck. The last thought is, the DPI AI interface is very interesting. As you bring AI into DPIs, like voice activated, and then so there's a lot of effort among Indian startups. If you look at the latest server AI tie-ups with some of these companies. So I think people think this is going to be our comparative advantage. I've heard something similar in Vietnam and other geographies. So there you need safeguards also. So the potential is huge, but the risks are also there of cyber fraud, for example. And then DPIs as diffusion pathways for AI. Because how to scale AI applications? One is the market-driven scaling, which, blitz scaling, whatever you want to call it. But the other is more thoughtful scaling in these kind of SDGs relevant areas, and where DPIs might provide an interesting option for societal-wide application of AI. Let's say, Nandan Nilekani at the AI Summit in India gave the example of dairy farming. So if they had to do it from scratch, it would have taken several years. But because the DPI foundation were there, so in a few weeks you could bring in something that helped farmers with cattle to kind of use AI for some aspects of dairy farming. Someone over there.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really interesting talk. My question is about the private sector in the AI. You've talked a lot about how the UN serves as a forum for governments and how the goal is to provide support to governments. But I'm curious about how much your office engages with the private sector, or maybe whether there's interest from the private sector in engaging with you, and what that looks like. I know that a lot of AI and digital infrastructure involves public-private partnerships. Does the UN play a role in governments navigating those? Yeah.
Right. So we have strong interest from the private sector to engage with these. Like, for example, the science panel, there's, although these are all independent experts, so there's a conflict of interest process that you have to go through. But you have affiliations with Google, Meta, Alibaba, and some of these companies that are active. I think obviously we know there are interests. This is not lost on us. So how do you kind of, through diversity, through this conflict of interest management, through multi-stakeholder engagement, you kind of balance those conflicting interests so that no interest is able to dominate. So bringing different vectors together, have that balanced discussion, because you can't just leave the private sector out. And these frontier companies are literally running their own computer science departments within their companies, and the numbers, what's going on, and some safety issues only they understand. So we need to have them at a table. And I visit these areas, these geographies regularly. The Bay Area, China, some of the companies, Africa, India, wherever I go, I try and meet not only the big companies, but also the startups, because you get very interesting insights into what's going on. And I always see, on the UN's effort, no one says, maybe we are being polite, says, you're wasting our time, don't do this, etc. They say, yeah, helpful. The interoperability discussion is helpful. We are navigating very complicated governance issues. If you help us kind of land some common understandings, it's helpful. Second, the effort around capacity, absorption, diffusion, building local language data sets, helpful to us. And also the science panel, I have heard even the leading companies in the Bay Area say, we would benefit from a global floor on what the risks are. This is placing too much power in our hands. We didn't wish for it. It's happened. And we are often in a competitive race, and we can't get off the machine. So, what you do would help us. I think where I've often focused my effort is not to allow a few to dominate this conversation. They are essential participants, but they are not the whole world. So sometimes it's not popular, but I think what we do with the open source week, or what we tried to do with the launch of the dialogue and the panel back in September was, get, for example, in the keynotes, there was Brad Smith from Microsoft. His perspective is very important. But there was also Komal Sharma from Exotech, a woman founder of a startup from India. There was a startup from Nigeria, and both these founders spoke very eloquently about how they saw this space from the perspective of these companies in Nigeria and India. So I think we need those diverse perspectives, but absolutely 100% we need the private sector at the table.
I see Miranda here.
Thank you so much for being here. I saw that you had previously worked at the conference on disarmament, and I thought that was very interesting, and I was wondering if you have any reflections about similarities or differences between working on global security and nuclear issues, as well as AI technologies. Maybe these are related in your mind, or maybe they're completely different. And I would also be curious if, like, the discourse around sovereign AI, how that maybe plays into it.
Thank you. And we risk starting another lecture and fine, keep it brief. I think there are interesting parallels, but there are also clear differences. So my scholarship has been, nuclear learning, policy learning, production, nuclear forums, not just the weapons issue, but also the security issue, nuclear security. So, bad stuff can get out with a bang. That's your safety problem. Bad people can go in, so that's your security problem. I think there are strong parallels there. But I think if we climb up the ladder to weapons and proliferation, I think there we start to draw bad analogies. Because there, the pathway, there are only two pathways to the bomb. The high enriched uranium pathway, separated plutonium. There are clear choke points, where you can apply controls, safeguards, inspections, verification. I mean, there's an interesting discussion on AI verification going on, but I think bad analogies are a risk there. What's useful to keep in mind is that the transboundary effect and proliferation, somehow you cannot stop that. And also the differences in terms of the value chain in AI, the number of people involved, the limited role of the public sector. That's a stark kind of lesson, So if you compare with the nuclear domain, I think the bio domain, looking at the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention or the Pandemic Treaty, some of these other considerations is also interesting because where, you look at the AI risks, the lift you're getting in the biospace for non-state actors is more significant than in the radiological dispersion, device type of, of a threat. So I think we can learn a lot, but then, we should avoid naive analogies like, there's a petaflop switch where, from beyond which, you turn to some kind of an extreme risk scenario. One thing I've learned working on lethal autonomous weapons, so 2017, 2018, where, the idea was, how do we land modern understandings of international humanitarian law? The principle of distinction and proportionality. You see now with the conflicts that are going on, and some of the domestic debates in the US, I think this is for me the most potent understanding you can pull from that domain. That issues of life and death. You need to have human control, responsibility, accountability. And some of that accountability is under international humanitarian law. The commander is responsible under international humanitarian law if school children die or a hospital is blown up. You lose that. This fuzziness around who's accountable on safety, security, lethal harms. You lose that, and then you kind of lose the link with a law-based approach. You may or may not have an AI law, but we still have a world order, and we still have domestic order that's based in constitutions, in legal arrangements. I think this is the space to watch, because this thing is enhancing the power of certain actors in society in a way which is unprecedented. And power is governed through institutions. There's a balancing of power with responsibility. So I think that link is the one that we should keep our eyes like laser focused.
Thank you for such a nuanced answer. Do we have time for one last quick question? I think I saw someone's hand over there. Great.
Yeah, just very quickly, I wanted to tag along the previous question about private sector. So I was wondering, in your conversations with both the private and public sectors, whether you've seen any points of contention, particularly around regulation. And do you see the UN as a medium by which those points can be reconciled in any way?
Right. Yes. So this is also a big question. There are many areas in which you see the contention and where the UN could be helped. I think what's not helpful is these assertions. The technology is moving too fast. We can't do anything about it. That's not true. And then that somehow government should not regulate because that comes in the way of innovation. I think it's a false dilemma. So if we leave those kind of that posturing aside, there are some practical areas. Let's say agility of governance. So being able to accordion governance in or out as you understand the risks. So the link with understanding risks, the science side of it, and the policy response. It's not just a kind of a nice thing to have, well structured, but if there is a kind of accordioning of policy issue, which would require the private sector to work more closely with the public sector and with academia, where you can get those independent assessments from. The second area where I see we could have the metrics and the benchmarks around performance, around real world impact, data in terms of, let's say, impact on children. I think the private sector needs to be more transparent. And through that transparency, they can win the trust of the public sector. Look, we will alert you. You can trust us. We will give you the data if things are going the wrong way. And then, you could perhaps help us do something about it. We've seen that with countering violent extremism or terrorism in the past. You remember those beheading videos on YouTube, and then, once they landed up against some of these ads for these prominent companies, private sector woke up, no, this is not just a kind of, problem to be managed by the public sector. So I think there are these clear areas, and I would add just one last one, which is this understanding the differentiated landscape. China, for example, the Gen AI guidelines, but then also eventually there may be an AI Act. There's a ministry level effort, CAC, MITI, others are kind of like, how do we understand that? How's the Chinese private sector landing that? And then how's the European private sector landing the EU AI Act? So there is a kind of a facilitation role in terms of, understanding that response and helping the private sector in different geographies. This is how we could handle some of these safety issues. Our internal teams, governance teams, ethics teams, whatever you want to call them, can be structured this way. So kind of providing a conveyor belt for this learning to kind of, pass through different jurisdictions.
Conveyor belt for learning is a great metaphor. On that note, USG Gill, this has been a tremendous conversation. Thank you so much for spending your time with us on behalf of the Princeton and the ICP. I know this is your first Princeton visit. I'm sure it won't be your last. Look forward to many continued collaborations. Thank you very much.